And now back to our top story. The government's plans to fast-track the reopening of processing centres on Manus Island and Nauru. Professor Pat McGorry is a mental health expert and former Australian of the Year. He's worked with refugees for over 25 years and was a co-founder of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. He was one of the mental health experts consulted by the government's expert panel on asylum seekers. Pat McGorry, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
What advice did you give the expert panel on asylum seekers about the mental health implications of returning to offshore processing?
Well, along with another group of mental health experts, and I'd include Paris Aristotle, my very good friend and colleague in that. He worked shoulder to shoulder with him over the last 25 years in this area. We all know the facts in relation to the mental health consequences of prolonged detention. We know that after about 6 and certainly 12 months in detention, mental health will deteriorate, and there's very good evidence for that. We also know that people who have been through previous detention and torture and severe trauma of other kinds are especially vulnerable to these effects, and particularly children and adolescents. So these are the sort of things that we discussed. And I think the principle we tried to uphold was that it's unacceptable to cause harm, to cause damage to people's mental health in the interests of adding to the deterrence, which is obviously part of what this reform is about. And I do think we have to be pragmatic here. The reform is going to be happening now, so we have to turn our attention to how we can minimise the mental harm that's going to be potentially caused.
Were you surprised that your concerns were overlooked by the panel in their recommendations?
Well, I think I have spoken in detail to Paris about this issue, and if you look at the report, what the panel believes is that this is going to be pursued in a different way, that the detention conditions will be different from in the past. It'll be open detention, and that there'll be a series of programs and safety nets put in place. And I think that's the way to concentrate on this. The safeguards are, given this is going to be happening, we've got to make sure the safeguards are put in place to the extent they can be. And this will involve things like initial screening out of torture survivors. Obviously, that's not safe to be detaining torture survivors in these sort of locations, and I think that was originally part of this present government's policy to fast-track them out of this sort of environment. To make sure the environment is much more positive. I think a key recommendation is to have a roll goal guarantee on the maximum duration of detention, and I think the coalition in the past has actually supported that upper limit on length of detention, so surely that's a possible point of agreement between the government and the coalition to protect mental health. And then I think genuine mental health screening, a safety net, so that if people are starting to decompensate in a serious way, and I don't mean in a trivial way, but in a serious deterioration of mental health, that again, that they are provided with access to specialised mental health care of the right quality. That's a key issue. And then I guess also there are other issues to do with families and so on, which have been mentioned as well. But I think that the expert panel has thought about these issues, and certainly I know that Paris is deeply troubled by them and would have attended to them. And he's obviously torn, as he said last night, between the drowning deaths on the one hand and the risks to people through policies on the other hand.
One of the policies put forward by the panel is to eventually double the humanitarian intake of up to 27,000 refugees a year. Won't that alleviate the mental health problems of a whole lot of refugees stuck in camps around the world?
Yeah, absolutely, and this is something that the panel have made a very good point about, that there's definitely a number of positives in the proposals of that nature, so that will definitely assist. So I mean, there are trade-offs on both sides here, and obviously we've got to try to minimise the downside of the trade-off in relation to detaining people in the Pacific.
What concerns you most about the recommendations?
I think the extent to which indefinite detention is demoralising to anyone, and certainly to people who have already been through very traumatic experiences. Now, it might be argued, for example, coming back to your earlier point, that if people are not in refugee camps in Indonesia or in Malaysia and other places, if they're actually looked after in New Guinea and Nauru under quite different conditions from under the previous government, which seems to be what's recommended, that their situation could be better as long as the detention isn't indefinite.
It may be better, but could it still have a negative mental health consequence on the individuals concerned? We're talking about potentially 4 or 5 years. If you look at how long people are staying in different areas of Southeast Asia where they're waiting to be processed by the UNHCR, and if there is a no advantage test applied, then surely that will match those similar waiting periods in those areas.
Yeah, I think that is the issue, the no advantage issue, if that means the detention is going to be a matter of years. But I don't think that's not the intention of the expert panel, I don't believe. But what actually happens in reality is what matters, not the advice provided by the panel to the government and being considered by the coalition. I think that the safeguards need to be built in. Now, that might be described as cherry picking, but it's cherry picking with a view to protecting mental health.
Well, the Minister says the Nauru facility will hold up to 1,500 people. If that's the case, what kind of mental health services will they need on Nauru to protect the mental health of those people?
Well, if it's not a closed detention facility, if it's an open detention facility with a whole lot of programs, meaningful activities, and which is what's been proposed, then I think the mental health consequences might be less than what was seen in the past period. But it's really the length and I suppose the most demoralising thing about being in this limbo is that there's no future. The person loses hope for any sort of form of positive future life. Now, that obviously is occurring in the refugee camps in other parts of the world as well. So it's a wicked problem, I think, in that respect. There's no immediately clear perfect solution. But we've got to make the best of this now, I think, given that it's going to happen in Australia in this way.
The Prime Minister today asked the Army to build some temporary camps in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, with some asylum seekers to be housed initially in tents. Are you concerned about the conditions that asylum seekers might be sent to, living in tents in the tropics?
Well, on Christmas Island that was a problem when there was a lot of overcrowding and people were in tents there. I think the conditions are actually critical, especially as we say for vulnerable people. We've got to make sure that they're optimised. So yeah, look, I'm not sure about the details of implementation, but they're obviously critical. The devil is in the detail.
You're in Canberra at the moment. Part of what you'll be doing tomorrow is talking to politicians of all sides about the mental health reform agenda, which you've been talking about a lot over the last few years. How much of the mental health agenda in relation to refugees will you be talking about tomorrow with politicians? And if so, what kind of hearing do you expect to get? Well,
look, I think people are actually concerned about this aspect of it. I think all sides of politics, no one wants to see more harm come to vulnerable people. I don't think anyone really wants to see that happen. So I think we will touch on that. But the main focus tomorrow is actually to make sure that the mental health issue is constantly on the minds of politicians of all sides of the political spectrum. We want to see solid and continued support for investment and reform in mental health in Australia. We've seen that in the recent past. We want to make sure it doesn't dissipate this momentum, and because a lot of people around this country are suffering as we speak from the weaknesses still that are in our mental health system.
Pat McGorry, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you.